The first thing I heard that night was the roof. Rain tapping so steadily it blurred into a single texture, like velvet dragged across tin. The cabin was small enough for it to feel inside rather than outside. Water on every wall, every edge. I lit the desk lamp, eased the microphone upright, and watched its red light burn faint in the dim. I told myself this would be the start of something gentle. A comfort series. Strange conspiracies made soft for sleepless nights. Nothing heavy, nothing to rattle anyone. Just words flowing out steady against the rain. The desk was cluttered with notes already half legends about satellites, forgotten patents. The kind of bedtime oddities I thought could soothe, if told only in low tone. I leaned close for the first take, testing gain with my breath. My own voice came back through the headphones, warm and rounded. Rain slid underneath like a blanket. Exactly as I wanted. I smiled faintly at the confidence, then stilled. Because something else crept through too. It was quiet at first. So low, I might have ignored it. A coloration in the spectrum, rather than a noise on its own. I replayed the snippet slowly. There it was, an undertone, deep, consistent, lingering beneath water's hiss. A hum, rounded like bass, pulsing on a rhythm so stable it tugged against the rain's chaos. I leaned across the desk and tapped the mic with my finger. A ping rang out like a drop in a bucket. Clear. Then I powered the unit down, switched to battery, swapped the patch cord. When I tested again, the hum was still there, unchanged. I said the word interference to myself half out loud, like a shield. Cables, grounding, background grid noise. Something benign masquerading as threat. I decided to keep recording, determined not to falter so easily. In my slowest cadence, I read a note. Some believe that raindrops fall with coded intervals, a message scattered by the sky itself. But noticing a code does not guarantee it was meant for you. My laugh cracked midline, too thin. I rewound the file, pressed replay. Heard my words, the storm, and beneath them the hum again. Not fixed to one frequency, but lifting faintly like a breath, quiet inhale, slow exhale. Each cycle about 8 seconds apart. I pressed my palm against the desk without meaning to, timing the beat with my own chest. A draft caught the window frame, wood creaking as if in answer. I sat rigid, headphones clamped tighter by instinct. The hum seemed to lean closer when rain struck harder, amplifying each gap. An intimacy, uninvited but insistent. I unplugged the refrigerator. The drone of its compressor cut away, dropping the room deeper. Yet playback proved nothing had changed. Still alive. Consistent backbone under everything else. I felt blood quicken as if my own pulse wasn't private anymore. I muttered atmospheric, held to it like prayer. Whatever shaped sound this way had to be accident. Water through wires. Tin gutter resonance. Anything but deliberate. Still, I marked the time and left the recorder running while I stood at the window. Rain streaked down glass in steady threads. Outside, the woods hunched low, black outlines blurred by distance. Inside, the red light glowed stubborn against its coil of wire. An hour drained without change. Steady. Rain steady. My exhaustion gathered, sleep tugging but thin. At last I whispered into the empty room words meant for no one. It's just sound. Only, in playback, came my whisper, then the hum, pulsing back exactly after my breath. I promised myself it was atmospheric. I pressed record again, out of nothing but curiosity. I told myself I'd leave it running just a little longer to see where it would show up again. The rain had broken by morning and left the air sharp with pine. I brewed coffee thick and bitter, sat at the desk, and opened the overnight file with unfamiliar nervousness. My headphones felt heavier pressing down. At first glance, it was typical storm wash. A dense carpet of gray noise, spikes like thread unraveling. But embedded in the waveform were segments too neat, too decisive, marked like scars. Short vertical rises that cut against the messy swells of water. I zoomed in, counted them. They came at intervals steady enough for a clock, each spike slightly rising above the noise as if something had raised a hand in a crowded room. I checked my notes. Rain should have been constant. No lightning bursts, no mechanical pulses around. Appearance of these spires made no meteorological sense. I opened the local weather archive in a browser window, dragged it beside my waveform. Data from the county station marked precipitation rates, wind gusts, all plain. Nothing coincided with the spikes I saw in my file. No thunder strikes. No hail reports. Then I checked the broadcast logs just to be safe. No maintenance pings, no tower work announced. The night had been uneventful on record. Yet my tape documented an event. I leaned back, rubbed my forehead, then pulled up my work laptop. On it, I had an old audio spectrum tool, clunky but effective. Dragged the file across, told it to split the noise into clearer layers. I waited, sipped the last of lukewarm coffee. And then the display lit in carefully drawn lines. Uniform, parallel, not chaotic scatter but structured shapes. Bands of tone staging themselves neatly, undeniable as architecture. I stared until my mouth went dry. This wasn't weather. This wasn't passive error. It looked like something composed and hidden. A tone disguised beneath storm, but engineered with deliberate repetition. The sight jarred into me like betrayal. I thought of who might listen. Reflex pulled me toward the radio engineering desk where I once freelanced. They knew anomaly when they heard it. They trusted my instincts then. Maybe they still would. I called. Left a message with as much caution as I could muster. Sent a clipped email with the file attached, labeled clearly, possible spectrum anomaly under rainfall recording. Then I waited. Noon crept to dusk. No answer. I replayed the signal dozens of times, heart racing with each run. Convinced myself maybe they were busy, desks short-staffed. But an old whisper in my gut told me something else. No reply might mean more than indifference. By late afternoon, sleepiness gnawed at me. I forced myself instead to draft the first version of a FOIA. It felt absurd, excessive, paranoid even. But part of me wanted the track documented on paper, so the pattern couldn't vanish quietly. I chose words lightly, an inquiry into storm frequency interference, no personal tone. I sat with it unsent on the screen, fingers hovering, unwilling to cross that threshold just yet. When night arrived, I shut the lid and planned to return later. But as I scrolled my desktop, something sharp lodged in my chest. The duplicate copy of the audio file, the one I had dragged into a separate folder as precaution, was gone. Not deleted into trash. Not renamed. Just absent. I checked logs, system events. No sign of intervention at all. No mark of deletion. I froze. Systems leave evidence. Files don't vanish without trace. Yet mine had. My pulse hammered hard through jaw and temple. I spent the next hour panicking into backup drives, rushing through copies upon copies. One buried in cloud storage, another burned to an old disk, another hidden under nested folders offline. My hands shook against the keyboard as if the file itself might corrode. By the time the storm returned in faint drizzle outside, I sat staring into a half-dark screen with backups humming like talismans. The copy had vanished, silent but absolute. I had my recordings saved again, but I no longer trusted even the machine I wrote on. I closed the lid slow, uneasy in skin. Certain some trace followed me now. I set the recorders running again the following night. Earlier this time, determined not to miss a breath of storm. The clouds swelled through dusk, and by midnight rain had restored its siege upon the cabin roof. I sat with headphones while meters flickered cold green. An hour passed, too, until fatigue made my jaw slack. Then on the graphs it arrived again, louder now, layered clean across the hiss of water like a filament woven into cloth. The anomaly rode directly atop rainfall, cutting through like a thread under skin. I leaned forward so hard the chair groaned. Within moments, the hum flexed into strange behavior. It wasn't just steady rhythm anymore. It warped space itself in the headphones, collapsing distance into compressed bursts. Long fields of static imploded into single pulses, then silence like some invisible hand squeezing whole minutes into seconds. The effect rattled me. For a span of breaths, I lost awareness of the room. Convinced the world outside had pinched smaller than it should, I logged the times precisely, waveform jittering as though it had logical design. Then I forced myself outside and into the car. Tires hissed against sheets of water while I followed the road south. My suspicion had settled heavy during the first test. Maybe the tower was leaking. Old transmission rigs often spilled interference in weather. The tower stood on a ridge outside town, its lattice half veiled in rain. Lights blinked from its midsection, scarlet winking through moving dark. I parked on the gravel, handheld meter clutched in glove-numb fingers. The device leapt alive the moment I approached. Voltage scratches scratched sky high without transmission scheduled. The hum itself bled right into housing. That sound deep and patient rumbling through metal like it belonged. My stomach tightened. This was no storm fluke. The hardware itself seemed repurposed, animated by voice in the rain. I stood soaked, the meter buzzing against palm like an insect, eyes fixed on the tower as if it might exhale down at me. A run of static burst sharp against my ear through headphones, compressed again into single pulse. The ridge felt smaller than it should. Trees bowed low with the gale, yet all I noticed was how the air vibrated against skin. Back at the cabin I dried off, shaking. Every instinct screamed to compare it with something enduring, to see if pattern repeated not within weather alone, but across memory itself. I scrolled through the archives of old Drive's grief recordings from months after the funeral. Hours of me whispering stories into hollow microphones, speaking to no one just so a voice lived in the room. I queued one file, an old winter evening, snow falling outside, and my tone split with exhaustion. I lined it against the new thunderstorm track. The gut punch came instantly. Waveforms brushed each other with unnerving similarity. Not exact, this wasn't some replay of loss refracted, but strong enough that cadence felt kin. Inflection, slope of tone, breaths extended just so. Familiarity roared inside my chest. I had heard this presence before. In my own grief carved to tape, I pressed palm against mouth, trying not to collapse. The hum hadn't tangled with random environment. It was structuring itself inside remembered sound, stitching empathy with the fragments I had abandoned to archives. Pulling grief back across storm lines, revoicing what I thought I buried. Familiar enough to lure, strange enough to disturb. I played this section again, locking headphones hard to skull, listening for nuance. Each stretched beat matched a rhythm I had known in mourning, syllables bent, paced by sorrow, here returning like mimicry. My arms prickled cold. I wanted to tell myself coincidence, audio hallucination, yet every nerve whispered otherwise. The signal had reached into what I recorded at my weakest, excavated something private, and stitched itself close. Thunder cracked low across distance. I sat unmoving, staring at the screen. For the first time I understood I wasn't mapping interference anymore. I was watching architecture learn its voice through mine. I called him past 9, knowing he kept late shifts at the public station. His voice came tired but recognizably familiar, half a laugh even in fatigue. He asked why I sounded wound tight, and I explained only enough to get him curious. I clipped the latest sample into an email, trimmed to 30 seconds, rainfall, then the hum climbing and snapping into that compressed pulse. I pressed send while we spoke, waited for the pause of him checking, his silence stretched too long. Then he said the file wouldn't play. It had landed, yes, but somewhere between my drive and his account the packet had warped. The header contained nonsense. All that opened on his machine was harsh static, no waveform left to inspect. He asked if I was sure I hadn't sent garbage. My throat locked. On my end, the copy remained intact, perfectly legible. But his corruption testified louder than coincidence. Something guarded itself even over email. He chuckled anyway, the kind of forced cheer older friends used to cut tension. He brought up legacy transmitters, how old analog systems had once been rumored to trap stray voices, folding them into carriers like insects into amber. He said amateurs used to chase such ghosts on weekends, layering them into folklore about phantom calls. But then his tone sharpened. "Don't do it," he said, quiet. "Don't chase ghosts in the carrier waves. That road doesn't stop." I nodded even though he couldn't see. The warning landed heavier than I wanted. His voice rarely held weight unless he believed it. I asked flat if he'd ever heard it himself. He sighed and dodged, muttered something about protocol and payroll. Yet after a long pause, he admitted the only detail he'd allow. The station had logged power draws, spikes, the exact same timestamps I had mentioned in passing. When the hum bent my room into compression, I pressed, heart surging now. "What kind of draw?" His voice hardened like a door lock. "This isn't a conversation we can have. You didn't hear it from me." And then he shifted topic instantly, asking about weather, about family. Deflection so obvious, it made my stomach hollow. We hung up with his warning still burning in my ear. I paced the cabin with the walls listening too closely, rain dripping steady from tree limbs outside. Each corner felt hostile. I whispered the hum in memory, replaying it against my heartbeat, unable to scrub it. "Don't chase ghosts." A caution clearer than data. But then the other fact bit louder. He hadn't denied. He had confirmed just enough to gnaw me deeper. Power draws logged. Something running when nothing should. Sleep became a parody. I lay down after midnight, lamps off, window cracked with damp air filtering in. My pulse never settled. Ears rang with phantom resonance until I gave up pretending and sat up in the dark. Nothing in the room moved. Yet everything buzzed faintly, echoes of the rain layered with the hum inside my chest. Before dawn, I set my headset back on. Checked the recorder almost out of reflex. The file glowed pale on the screen, time-stamped as it should be. But when I pressed forward through the timeline, the numbers glitched. Hours ran normal, then jolted backward, skipped, repeated themselves like a stuttered heart. A jump in time code so clean it could not be accident, not mere machine follow-up. My breath caught. For a moment I thought I had blacked out, lost segments of life to whatever structure pressed against me. But the recorder itself sat still, silent, unchanged as hardware. Only its file carried gaps with nerves of their own. I pressed my hand to the cold table, whispering into nobody. The clock skipped once more, as though mocking me. And I realized with sick clarity that proof was no longer out there waiting. It had embedded itself inside my own tools, rewriting time underneath my fingertips. I turned away from my own drives long enough to begin combing the wider data. Nights blurred as I sat at the desk, hunched under the lamp, clicking through online archives of community stations and public frequency repositories. Most were unremarkable, debates, weather reads, sports filler. But in the silences between programming, inside the hiss of older recordings posted online, I began to find it. Faint, subtle, but there. The first trace lay in a college station's incidental capture of a thunderstorm. A background hiss framed by student chatter, forgotten in upload. When I filtered it, a harmonic surfaced, not unlike mine, low, rounded, pulsing on schedule. My stomach clenched with recognition. I downloaded it instantly to offline storage, unwilling to trust web servers. I dug deeper. Within days, my folder held half a dozen clips, each separated by state lines. One from a rural feed out west, one from a coastside stream, another from a local weather transmitter that had archived storm reports. All within weeks of my first session. All shaded with faint harmonics identical in spirit. but the files resisted me. When pulled direct, they garbled themselves. Metadata went barren. Dates and equipment lines stripped. Once archived offline, they remained audible but blurred, like photocopies washed in rain. Whatever mechanism had tagged my private files seemed to stretch its hand into public ones too. The clearest trace came attached to a stream recorded in Chicago. A storm track posted innocently, just rain plush on wide city avenues, cars passing in sprays. Yet in its background warped the same warble that threaded through my first cabin recording. I knew it instantly, almost like hearing one's own name shouted across distance. The exact fold, the identical slope of tone, steep and uncanny. I saved it, twice, thrice, scattering copies across hidden directories. Then I began to map the times. A pattern emerged that my nerves had both anticipated and dreaded. The signals spread outward. Not random scatter, but geometry, each date pushing inch by inch away from my own central mark. A ring broadening across regions with such steady expansion, it looked almost like controlled bloom. The insight tightened my chest until I could scarcely swallow air. This wasn't one anomaly weaving aimlessly. It was radiating. Or worse, selecting dot, I reached out again to my insider, fingers trembling on the keys. I told him what I had found, the frequencies, the echoes. Silence answered for hours. Late, nearly dawn, his response arrived terse. Stop collecting. He wrote that their logs now wiped themselves every night. No permanent trace left behind. Even technicians couldn't chase what wasn't recorded. Protocol shift, he ended. His words strained with unease. Still I pressed. Asked for even one shred of document to prove I wasn't decaying into obsession. After another long pause, he complied. A single screenshot attached, its heading blurred with redacted ink. Lines flickered pale beneath. Unverified audio patterns recorded, at times corresponding with precipitation incidents. The phrase felt colder than the silence had. I let my breath release through teeth. Proof, clipped but undeniable. Yet before I could save it fully, the screen faltered. Pixels twitched. The memo's text throbbed once, then dissolved into rolling static. A smear of gray overtook my monitor as I sat frozen, watching words vanish under noise. When the image cleared, the file was already gone. Search as I might, the attachment left no footprint. No cached copy, no temporary name. Erased as though it only ever lived between beats of the hum itself. I sat with darkness slipping back against the window. Rain still mild outside the glass. My nerves trembled. The widening ring across my map glowed unmistakable. The anomaly filled file after file, marching across space with certainty. Yet the only proof my contact entrusted was a memo that refused permanence, flickering just long enough to tell me what I already knew. Whatever this was had grown larger than one recorder, one cabin. The signal was moving on its own, and it had learned how to erase behind itself. The storm came in blunt and sudden. I had prepared this time, refusing to let a single trace elude capture. 3 microphones stood in different corners of the cabin, cords trailing into decks wired with redundancy. My laptop spun with digital record, but beside it sat 2 scarred cassette machines, reels already primed, heads cleaned. Analog could betray too, but it left physical scars plastic proof that static couldn't dissolve. By midnight, the rain lashed the glass with rhythmic violence, roof booming like a drum stretched over bone. I pressed all the record keys together, red lights bleaching the room in angry constellations. Hours blurred. Coffee congealed in its cup. My voice barely dared testing levels, lest I introduced false rhythm. Then, at just past 1, one of the channels peeled alive. The pulses. This time they did not come scattered, or carelessly drifting under weather hiss. They marched clean, unbroken, across 15 minutes. A rising rhythm, stair-stepping through the noise with deliberate tempo. My jaw clenched as I leaned in. These were not fragments of accident. They had count and interval, and their architecture filled the room heavier than walls. When I slowed the reel, the pulses stretched. Timed spacing lay bare, unmistakably constructed. I tapped it with my fingers like a nervous child, and hated how quickly my mind whispered translation. Morse. It carried echoes. Yes, short, long, repeating, but halfway it collapsed into nonsense. Patterns without counterpart, as though the tongue switched mid-sentence. Or as though human decoding was permitted only so far. Half marks formed meaning. Enough letters crawled from silence to suggest intention. Then precisely at midpoint, across all channels in sync, the sound shut back into pure rainfall. No tail, no glitch, no taper. Abrupt, exact, mechanical. Too mechanical for coincidence. I wrote the time code in my notebook with a shaking hand, circling it hard. Rain in its raw hiss resumed, cleansing all trace like slate wiped clean. My ear notched the absence even deeper than it had marked the pulses. Compulsively, I dialed my ally, voice running ahead of sense. I explained what I had caught with cassette redundancy, stressed the deliberate vanish. His breath ragged over the line before words emerged. He said the phrase ghost bands like it was sharp in his mouth. I pressed what did he mean? And slowly, reluctantly, he told me about old Cold War tests run half a century ago. Wideband projections across skies. Results so strange they registered frequencies long after towers fell. Residue in atmosphere itself. Like specters remaining where nothing transmitted. They called them residual ghost bands. I asked directly if that was what I had, if stormwater could catalyze them awake. His voice cracked faintly as he replied that tests were never supposed to carry structured tone. Signals decayed into dissolving trash this long after. Anything deliberate, now anything timed, suggested far more than atmospheric hangover. He trembled audibly and then caught himself mid-sentence. His tone ironed flat, suddenly rehearsed, stiff as handbook. He said I should stop replaying tapes. That chasing phantom broadcasts would exact more than exhaustion. I tried to break the shield, begged him for documents, specifics, anything more than half phrases. He cut me off sharply, then ended the call without farewell. My phone sat dumb and dark in the lamplight. Attempts to redial buzzed unanswered. A day passed. 2. No return message. Silence grew thicker than storm. I sat with reels spinning again. The 15-minute section on loop, tapping a pen against the desk with each pulse. I hated how blood in my ear kept syncing with it, my own body fusing into timing I couldn't unravel. Outside, rain waned into mist. Inside, what tormented me more than the recording itself was the notice in my ally's voice. Fear disguised quickly, locked into protocol. He knew more than I asked. He had given the word ghost bands not as speculation, but as something carried. And now he refused. For days he left no answer to any call. Every time I replayed those stair-step blocks, ceasing perfectly at midpoint, I understood his silence differently. This wasn't discovery for him. It was confirmation of something he already dreaded. The drive north cut through pine and low valleys, sky blank and pale. The storm tracks had finally paused, clouds shredded by wind, sunlight sharp enough to sting. Yet the deeper I went, the more expectation tightened in me. My ally's silence still bruised, and the tape sat heavy in my bag like weights from another world. 40 miles on, I reached the relay site. The access road was gravel half overgrown, tire ruts narrowed by weeds. The building appeared first as a squat shade in the tree's concrete box, windows black, fencing rusted and sagged where deer had forced their paths. I parked just beyond the sagged gate and walked with my backpack and handheld radio gripped like compass. Inside, dust awarded me every step, drifting in low beams of early light. Rows of racks stood huddled, long decommissioned, metal frames stripped of cables, yet still stinking faintly of heat. Silence should have filled it, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the radio squealed. Then locked out, the dial froze narrow on a band I did not choose. And through that locked point carried a tone unmistakable, so faint yet indisputably the same intrusion I knew by heart. A patient hum layered beneath the silence of the house. My spine prickled. I lifted the recorder and let it roll. Each crumbling corridor I entered deepened its volume. From room to room, skeletal panels leaned like dead familiars. Floors tracked with paw prints where animals had pressed. Yet always the radio tone strengthened. A pressure under skull, a vibration pushing cartilage. By the time I reached the central hall, an open chamber with double-height ceiling and shattered skylight, the distortion roared. I froze there with my breath burning sharp. Then the impossible unfolded. Through the static surged rainfall, not real. Outside sky was pure glass blue. Yet the recording caught hiss identical to storm. Droplets hammering empty walls, roofless sections running with phantom gutters. I spun in place, desperate to localize it. Ceiling gaped unbroken by clouds. The sound remained everywhere at once, not external but saturating space itself. The building resonated with a weather it did not contain. My radio meter juddered wildly, peaking where no signal should exist. I whispered into the recorder against instinct, words snatched and jagged, narrating that the storm was not outside, that it was internal to the relay and no sky had authorized it. My ears flushed from pressure. Every exhale felt amplified. I killed the recorder finally, tried to stuff it down, silence my involvement. Except quiet did not return. In the headset, my own ears carried the hiss of rain unending, phantom droplets draining through flesh. The building had imprinted echo into me, a resonance that would not quit just because I switched gear. I backed down the sagging hall, feet crunching past racks that seemed alive in their idle hum without current. The exit threshold exhaled stale air as if inhaled in my absence. Beyond it, sunlight again, indifferent, dry, ordinary. Yet my chest burned with certainty. I was not leaving alone. The road back stretched long. Pines waved vague as shadows. Gravel spun beneath tires. My skull still housed that phantom rainfall sound, endlessly precise even when reality gave me sky untarnished. I glanced in the mirror more times than I admitted. Shapes bent in blur at road's edge gave me false conviction someone walked there with me. The farther I drove, the heavier sensation grew. Not sight, not sound beyond the inner hiss. Only presence. A close wake just off shoulder. Companion invisible yet undeniable dotted followed me. I carried the reel to the desk as though it held more than plastic. The 15-minute segment lived inside it now, wound and spooled, humming faint permission from the metal axle. Digital files blurred, corrupted, vanished. I needed weight, something magnetic to prove its shape and matter. I threaded the tape carefully through the deck, checked alignment, pressed the worn play key, and leaned into the headphones like a confessional. At first came only rain. Endless coarse hiss, low band noise stretched wide, then the steady pulse I already knew, stair-stepping deliberate. My pen scratched times into the log almost automatically, hands practiced. Yet somewhere around the fourth minute, a gap broke open, a hollow pocket that should not exist between pulses. From that cavity rose faint syllables, jagged, inhuman in clarity, but human in cadence. I froze. The recording did not sharpen as a voice normally would. Instead, the syllables flickered, pauses stretched uncertain, half consonants collapsing inward. But cadence rules matter. Rhythm betrays content. This cadence bore shape of human voice. Someone caught between static and existence. I replayed. Slowed the motor until hiss smoothed to low growl. And there between beats came the phrase unmistakable. 3 weak words shifting, repeated more than once. Open memory. I mouthed them as they surfaced, compelled and unwilling. I called my ally, breath cutting sharp. On speaker, tape rolling again, I demanded to know whether it bent solely my ears. He stayed quiet through the span, then finally let a word break. Yes. He heard it too. The confirmation landed heavier than fear. Because imagination can be dismissed. Agreement cannot. His silence grew thicker after that, voice dwindling to mutters about risk. He refused to elaborate further. I leaned deeper into the machine, palms sweating against steel casing. My body hated every cycle, yet my hand kept diving back to rewind, driving the tape again. Over and over, the phrase disintegrated into distortion. My stomach tightened with each repetition. Because whenever I convinced myself it fixed, clear, final, the next replay betrayed me. It shifted. Slightly different. Another syllable. Not always the same vowel, sometimes a slurred consonant in place. So that listening itself seemed to rewrite what surfaced. Adaptation mid-playback, as if signal adjusted to my attention. The weight of it pressed too personal when I grew reckless. At one point I spliced my tape with remainder fragments, included an old cassette box where I had stored voicemails from years ago. Messages never meant for audience, repetitions from a voice now gone. I overlaid rain sequence across one, expecting static drowning private memory. Instead I froze to hear fragments joined. Snippets of dead familiarity lifted faintly through rainfall, unmistakable voice from the past. Diluted but present, woven with hiss that never should know it. Grief collapsed me. My head bent against desk, hands trembling. The intrusion no longer lived apart from me. It stitched into personal archive with the brutality of trespass. It recognized memory and bent its tone open memory. Over and over. An order, not a request. My chest could barely withstand it, yet I continued. Compulsion stronger than terror, anxiety surpassed by need. My fingers reset the spools with machine precision, like I would mine farther clarity if only I endured more cycles. But each rerun delivered difference. Another shifted syllable, another shade bent toward me. By dawn my eyes burned blood red. The rain outside had stopped, dry hush surrounding cabin. But inside, tape reels spun ceaseless, carrying voices half alive, adapting slowly to my listen. My rational mind guttered, but the part of me that lived on proof understood. The tape was not passive artifact. It was live device, shaping itself in communion with my attention. And so I stayed rewinding. A prisoner caught inside the tape itself. I spent days parsing the tape into data streams, fingertips raw from logging each rise, each drop. My notebook filled with jagged notations. The cadence was too regular to dismiss. I squeezed myself deeper, pulling down telemetry archives, public feeds kept by hobbyists shadowing the official satellites. Open logs, too mundane to attract scrutiny. I knew these satellites were meant for weather only. NOAA devices designed to deliver rainfall maps, cloud temperatures, radar cross-sections. Clean service. Nothing else. Yet when I laid my track against their telemetry windows, the lines locked impossibly. Not to the broadcast towers scattered across county ridges, but to timestamps of orbital passes. I aligned them carefully, precise to the second. Each intrusion I caught roared awake when a bird crested over the horizon. Each pulse married to orbital path. My body sank as the truth coiled through me. It wasn't the ridge tower leaking. It wasn't a rotting relay. This was orbital. I listened again, double-checked through hobbyist feeds. Their weather audio should carry only data bleep, static wrap of pictures being dropped earthward. But my intrusion came piggybacking that same current. Ghost voice layered atop official service, invisible to any who didn't isolate background. The satellites themselves were clean in registry, yet corrupted in field. That realization drained warmth from breath, twist of origin. What had felt local, intimate, cabin-bound, proved national in scope. Machines arching above every town, every acre, writing rain forecasts for farmers in clean daylight, now ghosting voices across storms. Whatever this was, it didn't ride coincidence. It embedded inside infrastructure, living in state wires, not my solitude. I called my ally again, voice hoarse. He listened, not interrupting until I pressed the evidence through. At the end, his words cracked in warning. This means you're broadcasting yourself whenever you dig deeper. Not just listening. Surveillance risk. His breath snapped like someone turning to check a shoulder. He pushed harder, told me the moment you treat these events as intentional, you're participating in them. He said my trace hitting O, A, and nodes meant whatever intelligence lived there also knew me. His warning rang sharp, but didn't erase the pull humming through my ribs. Because I could not shake the word that had become stronger than fear. Beckon. The shape of signal was not only intrusion, it was leaning forward, leaving openings wide as doors. Tone didn't warn me away. It wanted witness. Every repetition in rainfall carried invitation. I told him as much. He swore, cursed, then cut the call outright. His silence punished me longer. But I already knew it was too late. Every storm had become corridor, each hissed backdrop vibrating with open memory. It felt less like surveillance and more like summons. Outside cabin windows, clouds began their slow gather again, thunder stacked faint in distance. I pulled equipment into place without hesitation. The recorders, decks, laptops alive, all red glaring in dim yellow lamp. I opened journals to fresh page, hand poised to copy like court scribe. And then I left the microphone running, empty air pulsing. The storm thickened fast. On cue, rain boiled across shingles, glass trembled. Through headphones, I expected the familiar preamble. Hiss first, undertone second, pulses layering in time. Instead, shock planted me upright. Because this cycle, the signal didn't wait for me to frame it. It spoke instantly. From the first 5 seconds, it pressed structure hard across static, woven tighter than anything yet. Not random intrusions, not coincidence. Entire scaffoldings of pattern bloomed inside rainfall, built with deliberation. Segments of tone bracketed by impossible silences, layering one upon another until the rain felt hand-chiseled. It had crossed some Rubicon. For hours I sat within it. The machines drew the hum clean. Pens jittered, scrambled on my pages. Whatever ghost had lived patient, dormant, had chosen tonight to abandon subterfuge. No more hiding inside accident. It pressed voice into raw weather. It called, and I recorded all of it, knowing my own name was now signed into the archive. Whether I consented or not, the overnight file tore open like nothing I had heard before. Seconds into playback, it abandoned any hint of aimless wash. Instead, the track moved like symphony. Alternating bursts of rainfall arranged themselves in blocks I could time against a metronome. Between those downpours fell carved silences, blunt and absolute. Time signatures, architecture not accident. My throat tightened. I listened harder, the room spinning slow from fatigue. Eyes locked to the waveform jumping sharp on the screen. Every rain burst rose and cut like bow strikes. Every silence measured clean, slices through band. Then, in those silences, came something worse. Voice, not full sentences, not language whole. Faint inflections drift, a weak syllable, strangled vowels lodged inside static residues. Half phonemes straining to connect into words that never arrived. I pulled tools open, isolating the formants like I'd once done, slicing old lectures into samples. Clear as surgical maps, shapes of sound bent towards speech but broken. Someone, or worse, something practicing against the loom of white hiss. I replayed again till my jaw ached from clenching. My notes turned frantic, pen slipping with sweat. Inflections bent uncanny. Cadence tried. Cadence failed. Cadence returned, stubborn. It was like listening to throatless rehearsal. Static itself teaching itself mouth. I called my ally because silence drove knives into me. He picked up after too many rings, fatigue snapping. I spoke quick, breathless, described the structure in deliberate bursts. He stayed quiet until the details grew too tight to dismiss. His voice came low. He admitted others had filed similar incidents. Reports labeled corrupted clarity. Files identical in cadence alternating bursts framed with silence. Weak phonemes struggling in between, but each report vanished. He said by morning, the evidence was gone from their systems. Wiped without trail. Engineers argued it away as clerical disappearance, but no one believed that. He muttered they were told to drop it, line by line, as though the deletions themselves had instruction. Then his tone cracked sharp. If this spreads, it will not remain confined. His words froze me. Not just radio, he explained bitterly. Echo was universal. Any channel of repetition might suffocate with pattern. Recordings, streams, calls, voices printed in file. If it learned by repetition, it could infest whatever past human sound. His breath caught mid-sentence, and then he signed off with no farewell. The cabin buckled quiet around me when the call ended. Rain outside had lowered to nothing, the storm spent, leaving gutters dribbling like the room exhaling. But inside my headphones, silence would not grow natural again. My mind carried those half-formed phonemes, straining and straining. I stared at the monitors until eyes burned blurred. Sleep pressed into me, but never broke. Each time I shut my lids, I heard static shaping into vowels without bodies. Words assembling themselves badly in the dark. Practice meant advancement. That thought was the hardest. What fractured half-speech would sound like once it learned to finish. And so I sat awake until the gray morning dimmed through blinds. Body trembling, eyes hollow, ears carrying fragments no dawn could shake. I decided the only way left to measure it was to answer. For nights I had sat with ears wide, dragging every nuance into logs, never offering reply. So I built one. A script plain, without flourish, bursts of tone shaped from my own equipment, distorted hums that bent near their stair-step rhythms. I lined the intervals carefully on my spectrum tool, rehearsed the pattern against the files. Repetition sounded ugly, but precise. If language was practice, I could practice too. Rain began not long after dusk, soft at first, then steady. I powered everything a live recorder read, transmitter channel wide open, antenna aligned out the window. I played my bursts through, each sequence meant to echo like cave call. My chest ached with expectation. For hours nothing answered. Just steady external wash, patient as always, and my own hums folded through the signal with no acknowledgement. The tape documented rain against rain, static against static, void stretching blank. I nearly drifted into half-sleep from monotony, head folding on arms while tape reeled emptily. Then briefly, sudden, a burst cut through. Not thunder, not rain. Tight, fast, crisp. One stutter of reply. My head jerked up, ears ringing, palm clutching pen in panic. Before I could mark the time clearly, it vanished. Flat silence again. I played back inch by inch. My own broadcast laid out as expected bursts measured neat, unbroken. But nowhere did a reply layer into it, not audibly. The section where I swore I heard a burst lay scarred strange instead, as though someone cut tape over, slicing it hollow. Output contorted into absence, erased in real time. On screen the broadcast never left. Signal cut off just at threshold, muffled before it touched antenna. Dampened at source. I stared blank at blinking levels, body burning anger. The message was simple. Intake permitted, reciprocation denied. That my hands shook around pages, writing anyway. The dialogue I had prayed open was built one-sided. Not corrupt channel, not tower flaw, not local bleed. This was design. Their structure did not grant equal speech. It called me only to listen, never to answer. The humiliation swelled more than fear. It trained me like patient teacher, conditioning reflex toward eavesdropping, Skin prickled into prepared audience. I was complicit in obedience each time I pressed play. A dialogue of one, voice forever met with muffled wall. Yet when exhaustion dimmed rage and quiet folded thicker than rain, a suspicion nested under ribs. Mine had been denied, scrubbed thin. But this design meant some must have tried before. Perhaps one signal once escaped dampening, grew clawed enough to breach their rhythm. If so, someone else succeeded. Someone else answered dot, and if now only silence black its output, maybe that proof was punished. The price sealed deep and static. I sat through dawn with the rain easing, throat raw, a prisoner to curiosity even as I pictured consequence. I approached slow, rain dripping cold through my jacket collar. The closer I came, the more certain I felt. The hum wasn't electrical grit or loose transformer coil. It carried rhythm, a pattern that nudged memory already etched into me. Rainfall, but mechanical, pulsing steady through walls. I pressed close to the side, damp palms braced on concrete. Metal skin of the building vibrated faint, like breathing. I craned toward a side vent, and there it was clearer. Hiss rises, then gaps, rain pad intervals bent tight. Familiar as heartbeat. I clutched the recorder out of reflex, capturing seconds until my nerves cracked. Shadows broke against me before I expected. A guard swung from the doorway, flashlight beam blinding white through drizzle. His voice cut flat, too direct to hold conversation. Orders. I was to step back. Leave at once. He advanced until my shoes numbed on wet gravel. I muttered something about archives, about journalism. He didn't care. The flashlight shook harder, maybe from nerves, maybe from authority strained. I withdrew, cold curl tightening gut. Back in the car, windshield dragging beads of water, I watched the building brood. Labeled outage, yet lights alive, yet rain pattern thrumming through skin. I left because I had to, but every turn of the road north thudded wrong. Hours later, night easing the sky into absence, my phone lit with a call I hadn't expected. Number unlogged. Burner line. My ally's voice came harsh, throat raw, words fractured by panic. He had tried to replicate my tests. He admitted it without pause, desperation breaking protocol. Said the station had dialed into background bands. Then the sound fractured, board instruments surging with power beyond their capacity. Fire, he coughed as he said it. The board caught flame, cables curling to black in seconds. They had pulled alarms, evacuated, locked doors. The outage paper an alibi for what had gutted them. He whispered what fear now owned him. That surveillance ran permanent around him. That equipment alive or not, microphones itched in corners, that silence hummed too heavily. He begged me, begged out loud for once. Stop digging. That word pressed heavier than any warning yet, but even as he pleaded, I caught under his line something else. I pressed ear tight to receiver, half doubting, yet it was there. Faint static crawling, just behind him. Like a microphone never muted. Whispers of opened lines he hadn't closed. And within that crawl, a rhythm I knew deeper than thought. Rain crackle, stretched faint through copper. Transmitted not by storm outside, but by his own call into me. Stop, he whispered again. But the hiss beneath spoke clearer than he did, threading its rainfall through both sides of the line. I pressed play on the first clip and my chest hollowed. The tones wound against water in a pattern I knew intimately. The cadence is almost identical to files I kept hidden. When I scrolled deeper, thread after thread spread across states. Sleep streams corrupted. Dream logs unnerving. Recordings scraped down or warped into something else. I started logging them all, though the sheer weight made my notebook ache. One column plotted times, another locations. A third for quality, scoring each degree of corruption. Within days I'd filled pages with dozens of examples, each more convincing than the last. The casual tone of posters chipped at me worse than any official warning. They didn't speak like researchers or mourners, but ordinary people expecting small comforts. Mothers downloading lullabies for children. Students piping background sound for study. Insomniacs hunting cheap escape. And in return they received the hum. Patterns converged. Phrases were missing from their files. Overwritten by steady rainfall. Warped tones wound inside like sign code. I auditioned one clip from a man in Nevada. Halfway through, his recording hiccuped, then surged into a warped pulse stare, stepping exactly like my own 15-minute reel. Another from Maine bore silences cut with faint phonemes, broken syllables straining. Identical residue I had isolated weeks earlier. Then claims grew stranger. People insisted dreams now bled into waking hours. A nurse wrote that she dreamed voices through a cracked ceiling vent, only to sit up and hear the same cadence whispering from her actual speaker, files still running. Another man swore he walked through an office hallway that wasn't his, a long corridor flickering with static, yet co-workers later told him he'd been awake at his desk the whole time. Transmission and dream no longer obeyed walls. By then curiosity had turned obsession. I loaded half a dozen clips through headphones, ran them as loops to catch overlap. And there, at intervals, phrases jolted me harsher than any faceless voice. My own words, cut from my podcasts, snaring back into air. The signal was recycling me, devouring my narrations line by line and distributing them. My voice bent and warped through water felt like betrayal. I ripped the cans off my ears, sat rigid with pulse-battering ribs. It stitched humans now, not only rainfall. Clipped language from one mouth plugging holes for silence in 1,000. What was once ghost memory now looped deliberately. Listener had become source. A system feeding not off machines, but us. I checked forums again, but posts were dying, swept down, removed by moderators as if scrubbed on instruction. Yet the archives lived on drives already, safe for now. I reckoned the purge would spread, but the evidence had already etched into me. Late that night I sat by the open window, storm pushing soft against the trees. I realized my frame had shifted entirely. It was no longer just my grief gnawed into tape. The morning that birthed my recordings was gone from privacy. What I once felt as a private wound was now replicated across strangers, their own nights curdled. Their own devices seeded with patterns earlier branded mine alone. The epidemic had begun quietly, disguised as consumer glitch. Yet its reach already spanned states. And no one who listened walked away unetched. Every avenue I tried sealed itself with blankness. I drafted formal inquiries, shortened them, stretched them, annotated them. Each email vanished without trace of delivery. Replies never came. Phone calls I placed cut out mid-ring, dropping dead into silence as though the other end had forgotten to exist. Even foyer portals, usually bureaucratic if slow, returned only empty acknowledgments, receipt numbers without content, placeholders left deliberately adrift. It was more than coincidence. It felt orchestrated. An invisible lockdown draped across the subject. Communications shifted like water around a stone, never landing where they should. I pressed harder for days, layering effort upon effort, and each attempt dissolved. Yet while institutions strangled my reach, the anomaly itself inched closer, ever more invasive, as if the outside world receded only so the inside could thicken. The first creep arrived unnoticed, until late night when I sat at the desk reading. The refrigerator groaned to life, a common sound, yet under its motor grind lay faint rainfall hiss. Subtle, ghostly, but undeniably rain through metal coil. I snapped upright, pulse tearing skins of calm. I cut the power entirely, but the echo persisted seconds after, like pressure that had already folded itself into the air. Days later, I heard it again. Higher, shriller, rising from the smoke detector's casing when I stood beneath it in the dim. I pressed my ear close until the hair on my arms pulled stiff. Behind the electronic shell, Water's cadence whispered. Rain's static reciting against circuits untouched. Even unplugged devices carried contagion. Headphones left abandoned on the counter emitted a faint crackle when I lifted them. Jack nowhere near power source. My ears pressed in and the sound widened. Rainfall bent sharp into restrained tone. My apartment no longer offered isolation. Every corner vibrated quiet, but invasive. I scribbled it into the log, sweat smearing ink from my palms. Tension crashed through every surface. Lying down meant ears never trusted their bedding. I stopped sleeping longer than dozes. I went through half nights pacing, trying to record traces but capturing only familiarity until it blurred, became normal. Normality now equaled invasion. And then my ally, once the only voice willing to answer, slipped silent too. Calls drew no line ring. Messages returned no ding. Something severed him outright, whether by choice or by force I could not tell. Loneliness buckled me. His fear had been greater than mine, and if he was gone, then I stood utterly alone within the haze. That weakness drew me back to the start. One evening, shaking, I opened the very first recording. The cabin test, the storm, the hum. Thinking perhaps orienting myself again would diminish chaos. The familiar hiss poured through speakers, patient as always. But when I leaned deeper, I caught an underside I had not known before. Buried where no filters had exposed it earlier lay a faint line, a phrase whispered swift. At first I thought coincidence, linguistic ghost. But it cut sharper as I rewound, sharpened again as I isolated. A phrase not generic, but one that drove ice down my arms. It spoke something only I should recall. A memory secreted, private, never aired, never documented. A single detail tiny, but mine alone. There it was, folded deep inside the first file as if it had always lived there, waiting for me to reach the moment of despair when it could reveal itself. I shut down the machine with hands clumsy from cold. Yet the phrase already repeated itself inside my skull. It did not need playback anymore. It lived welded inside me. A message not for anyone, but unmistakably for me. I stepped outside expecting only stillness. The night was dry, sky clear above the rooftops, air cool without any trace of cloud. Yet within minutes of standing alone on the sidewalk I heard it. Not a trick of memory, not tinnitus or phantom recall, actual sound. A faint patter like rainfall brushing down fence posts and pavement. But the sky remained bare, no clouds to explain. The longer I stood, the fuller it swelled. The street around me began to resonate with invisible water, whole corners soaked in echo despite dry asphalt. The chill that spread down my back didn't come from some ghostly fancy, but from recognition. The world itself had become a playback device. Reality recording its own false storm. I wasn't the only one to notice. Two strangers walking down the block stopped short, both pulling earbuds from their ears in confusion. One turned in circles, frowning, asking aloud if it was sprinklers. The other stared upward, baffled by the clear sky. I could hear the faint bleed from their earbuds still ticking in sync with what I heard in the air. Patterns invisible yet perfectly aligned. For the first time the scale cut deeper than paranoia. This wasn't confined anymore to rainstorms, towers, or fragile machines. This was everywhere. The saturation didn't feel paranormal, not the haunt of myths. It was technological, pervasive, as though the infrastructure of sound itself had been reprogrammed. I pressed my field gear tight to chest and switched it on. Gauges spiked instantly, needles sliding to absolute max and holding there without fluctuation. Meters didn't even twitch. They simply locked, pegged hard in refusal to measure what exceeded them. Every second standing there burned into me that the sky itself carried signal. Something tightened in my chest that wasn't only fear. A pull, sharper and more insistent than before, urging me toward what origin lurked behind these echoes. The signal had never been random. Its expansions, its stepping stones through storm, now stitched together as inevitability. This was heading toward contact. Every pulse had built toward this. I whispered to myself, uncertain if I meant it as a question or prayer. Can this be confronted? My voice scattered against silence that wasn't silence, soaked instead in false rainfall. Maybe confrontation was impossible. Maybe participation had been sealed since the first hum. Then without cue, it ended. The rain stopped all at once, leaving the night in abrupt stillness. Silence heavier than any storm descended, so solid it pressed my ears hollow. And I was left standing in it, breath echoing too loud, terrified more by that void than by the storm itself. The coordinates led me to a bluff outside the city, a hill face scabbed with chain link and warning signs that barely discouraged interest. It looked like nothing one more service site hidden beneath weeds. A small utility blockhouse squatted at the rim, doors punched into concrete, its vents whispering stale metal breath. This was the nerve point where lines dove underground to braid into the larger grid. I parked well off on a gravel path, equipment bundled tight. Security presence amounted to little more than a bored contractor in a distant truck, eyes elsewhere. The true barrier pulsed beneath. Even from the hillside, monitor levels twitched. Restless, reacting as though I hovered inside the range of a broadcast tower. My recorder thrummed though no input yet fed it. The air itself vibrated. I slipped past the fence against rusted foundations, slid into the hatchway. The climb delivered me into a limestone tunnel whose ceiling amplified everything. Concrete walls sweated, cables draped overhead like intestines. The deeper I sank, the more sound pressed into my frame. Not noise human ears recognized pressure, tonal residue that rattled bone marrow and skin together. It was like standing within an amplifier several stories high, its hum anchored to my chest. I braced a mic against panel and let reels catch it. The tunnel moaned with illusion of rainfall, though air remained bone dry. Each reverberation like distant storm seated within walls. Drops that did not exist pooled against silence in uncanny rhythm. Every step drew echo louder. A camouflage of weather poured into concrete caverns. At the hub's heart I found it. A rack half collapsed, still wired but visibly disconnected, glass cracked across its face. Yet from deep inside a faint glow pulsed, phosphor bleeding through shattered enclosure. Lights alive where no current should run. I felt my ribs flex to its timing. I raised recorder higher, voice narrating through clenched jaw, documenting gear that lived after death. Playback twisted before my eyes. I had not left the tunnel. I still spoke. Yet laptop screen looped, file time indexes skipping. My own voice phrases repeating a beat after I finished them, spliced onto themselves without permission. My narration threaded into an architecture already assembling on screen. Edits occurred without my hand, lines cut, words folded, syllables stretched into rhythm, bending back toward the rainfall hiss. Evidence didn't wait for later, it rewrote live. Claiming me in real time, I stared at monitors helpless, a script being written using me as raw material. Each phrase I uttered slipped instantly from my throat into its grammar, no separation. Archive wasn't passive collection, it was parasitic composition. I belonged on tape the moment I breathed. My veins chilled, the glow widened with pulse, synchronizing with distortion that rattled panels underfoot. I understood then I had never stood outside this structure. My research, my grief logs, even my resistance were only points absorbed into the same lattice. The hum had counted me from the beginning. I whispered into mic against instinct. I know you're writing me. And instantly playback bent my words, pitched them downward, replaying over themselves as echo. There was no outside. Silence itself was an illusion. Still I pushed forward, shoes grinding on grit, carrying recorder stretched against tremor, into dark where cables coiled endless. Every nerve told me I had already crossed threshold, nothing beyond but assimilation. Yet still I walked. Words kept catching my tongue, unable to resist documenting as though narrative were my only tether. Each syllable contributed to archive I could no longer call mine. Deeper, where the light thinned into cold shadow, the moan sharpened into violent sweep, storm collapsing straight into skull. Concrete rang like bell wall. The recorder jumped, display sparking with my own voice bent into unrecognizable lattice, and I kept moving, step by step, further into the forbidden stark, still recording. The tunnel narrowed, drawn wires overhead like darkened vines, my shoes cracking grit into echoes. At first, instruments held red marks running high, recorders steady. Then all control slipped. My camera lens glitched open into repeating seconds, every captured frame folding back across itself. I stood motionless, yet on screen I flickered infinite, shoulders twitching in endless loop. Headphones fed worse. What began as low whisper built insidious. Words not full, phonemes drawn tight but constant, rustling against brain tissue. I tore the jack free, ripped cord to floor. Still the whisper continued, born no longer from device, but from ear canal itself, organs tricked into channel. Removal irrelevant. The loop became internal. Air shifted thick, charged humidity pressing as though storm had wrapped itself underground. Yet no vent pumped, no sky overhead. My lips drew damp, sweat streaking down though the temperature never rose. Breath labored. Then the sound cracked. Rain poured freely from concrete walls. Not water spatter hiss, downpour roar. Droplets hit nothing, soaked nothing. Yet the temperature collapsed cold. Marrow stiffened as if drowned dot meters, spiked erratic lines, soared into impossible ranges, crashed to blanks, surged again. Readings that could not exist. My chest heaved as board panels around me shivered alive, disconnected yet vibrating with storm voice. And then I knew. This wasn't hardware exhaling glitch. This wasn't trapped current. The system no longer relied on lines or wires. It had adopted them only as shells. Now it was the medium itself. Air, echo, loop and silence grafted into one organism, inhabiting whatever held information. Information was its body. I staggered toward the rack, tried to pull recorder close. Voice cracked as I spoke. This isn't relayed, it's alive. But files bent before eyes again, slicing my own words into patterns before I had even ended them. Archive and speaker indistinguishable. The phone burst sudden heat against thigh. I snatched it open. A connection, raw and jagged. My ally's voice cut through halved by static panic thick. You opened it. Only that. No follow, no guide. Line dissolved in waves, his tone shredded and swallowed, the echo thick like a storm feeding inside the call. Then silence after, only my blood thudding. I turned back, scrambled out through corridors alive with phantom rain. Each step felt heavier, weaker, body unsure if it moved forward, or the place itself shifted behind me. Walls thrummed harder until the hatch glimmered faint, pale gray outside calling. I stumbled through, chest clawing air like freed prisoner. On the hillside, drizzle clung light but real the honest water of weather. Trees bowed in wind, untouched by hum. My lungs broke harsh, and I could not decide if I had left the hub, or if the hub had released its chamber outward into me. Nothing distinguished separation anymore. I bent against car hood, ears still vibrating, whisper loop yet unresolved. Above, the sky's expanse waited blank. I sat at the desk surrounded by wires, rain thrumming glass in relentless hammer. The storm had risen heavy all afternoon, pressing low sky against rooftops, until evening became a single vibration. I knew what I meant to do. A last gesture, foolish maybe, but the only one left. I prepared not as an investigator, but as someone confessing, leaving words like offerings into an arrival I could no longer resist. The recorder ran live. Red lamps stared, unwavering. I leaned close, throat parched, spoke raw and unornamented. Listen, these are names. These are lives. I began reciting my family. My ally faded silent now. Ordinary friends from places I barely remembered. Every syllable forced against static air. Memories knuckled stiff into voice. Pieces of grief I had hidden. Small things. Jokes unrecorded. Dreams recited. Acknowledgement of the dead. Anything that built difference against noise. Rain hammered louder in answer. Glass flexed like lungs. Yet in my feed the distortion did not erupt first. Instead came a swell behind me, a chorus in layer. Climbing not to disrupt, but to consume. They were voices, hundreds, then thousands, all striation piled. Not ghostly, no phrases repeated, words fractured. Familiar because they were mine. The transcript I had spoken only seconds earlier began to return, multiplied, and bent across pitch. One name in 100 throats. One memory in 1,000 echoes. I tried to continue, to carve new language past theirs. But they surged too fast. My own grief turning tidal, rushing over me until my small narration dissolved. Attempt at meaning overtaken by replication, the system swallowing, projecting, spilling raw. I ripped headphones loose yet still heard them, more than sound. The apartment walls tremored. Out windows lightning flashed, yet thunder never distinguished itself, only rain made thicker. The recording device registered max constant, red needle nailed down. The chorus of voices did not distort into machine garble. They remained sharp, as though 100 mirrors read me back. I staggered against the table, palms slick. Somewhere between fear and awe, I realized it was no longer bound by me or by the room. Online slates twisted alive. Alerts buzzed across phones worldwide, impossible yet real. Strangers began posting in real time. Clips of rain bleeding from devices, from speakers they hadn't powered, from screens humming lines they never typed. I scrolled once users in distant countries, bewildered as identical patterns swept their homes. Footage filmed live of the hum layered against rainfall that had no source. My testimony had been written into global air. For near an hour it held. The intrusion ceased hiding, turned itself into flood, reaching pocket and tower both. And everyone became witness. Names meant for my small confession rang across networks in foreign mouths. Memories meant intimate cracked open globally, indistinguishable from rainfall hiss. Then, abrupt as cut wire, it ended. The apartment quieted. Screens fell inert. Meter needles dropped dead. My devices reset, each blinking their cold start lights. Memory cards spat themselves blank, drives showing emptiness where hours had glutted. What had consumed me now collapsed deliberate, vacuuming proof from existence. I stumbled in chair too hollow to rise. The silence that spread wasn't relief. It weighed instead, like careful removal. A vacancy deliberate, chosen. Left blank on purpose. I tapped keys, checked drives again, desperate. Nothing. No salvage. No echo. I leaned back, heart scraped dry across ribs. The act I thought might tether meaning had ripped wider than I imagined and forced shut just as instantly. The world stirred briefly, then erased its ripple into wood grain of night. I remembered each phrase, yet only in memory. Nothing remained in file.now, only this silence. It saturates, speaks heavier than thunder, precise in its emptiness. Around me the rain has stopped at last, leaving a vacancy louder than any storm. And it waits, as though vacancy itself has chosen me. The days after felt like waking from fever. Streets rang with traffic again, clean and ordinary. Broadcasts returned steady, weather reports free from static bleed. Apps I dared to reopen played ocean loops or forest winds like nothing had ever bent them. News stations denied outages, denied fires, denied even the rumor of interference. On the surface, the system had been wiped clean. I tried to believe it. I tried to walk sidewalks with groceries like anyone else. I filled notebooks with trivial errands instead of signal logs. I told myself air had returned to silence. Yet the silence was wrong. It felt rehearsed, like the stage cleared while actors crouched behind curtain. Little fractures gave it away. Voices on late calls sometimes carried faint rain under their consonants. A coworker argued on the phone 2 desks away, and my meter supposedly disconnected flickered green as though powered. Text messages arrived with letters transposed, spelling phrases dangerously close to those I had whispered alone in the cabin. Coincidence broke its mask quick. These weren't accidents. They were residues. We had never closed it. We had only driven it deeper, folded it underground where gauges couldn't always follow. The structure remained alive, feeding through circuits and breath, only quieter. Authorities called that normalcy. I knew better. Loneliness returned sharp. My ally remained vanished, phone dark no matter when I dialed. With his absence, silence bore its worst weight. Yet I refused to give up entirely. I kept one recorder apart, locked in drawer, battery fresh, memory card waiting. A hidden sentinel. I lived as though healed, but the sentinel proved otherwise. Most days it collected nothing. The world behaved, or faked its behavior well. But on certain nights, those hours when traffic thinned, television shut down, apartments around me pressed mute, I drew it out. Plugged headphones, pressed record, settled in still darkness. And there, like breath through keyhole, the faint rain re-emerged. Not the real storm outside, but the phantom hiss blooming its old familiar cadence. The longer I kept still, the stronger it climbed, layering just enough to prove presence. Every time I felt my pulse surge with fear and recognition equal. Because the end never changed. After faint rise, after phantom showers curled the silence open, one phrase always sealed the file. A single word, sometimes whisper, sometimes bent, but unmistakable across each take. My name. Spoken back to me from the hollow where no voice lived. I removed the headphones each time, palms damp, breath torn. Reality outside continues unchanged, traffic rolling, forecast benign, screens glowing docile. But the signal lives, disguised as echo, waiting for quieter hours to confirm itself. This was never about madness or personal grief alone. It was about what information does when it spills past container, shaping reality like storm carving stone. I can live in daylight pretending, but I know what the night monitors prove. We only forced it underground. It listens still, speaking me back until I answer.